Yes, good morning to you all. Today we are doing life between two world wars. The life of England, the life of people of England between two world wars, the first world war and the second world war. Since the beginning of the civilization, the world had not seen a war on as a large scale as the World War First. When we examine the pages of history, it is quite clear that the World War First had been a great war since the beginning of civilization. Since the beginning of the civilization, the world had not seen a war on as a large scale as the First World War. Millions of people were either killed or maimed. So many people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people were either killed or maimed. And so many countries of Europe were near collapse. So many countries of Europe were near ruin or destruction or collapse economically. And in many ways, so many countries of Europe were near collapse. Britain was very much affected by the war and looked forward to a period of peace and prosperity. England was very much affected by the World War First. And after the war, the people were looking forward to it. They were expecting, they were anticipating a period of peace and prosperity. Unfortunately, the years after the First World War were very difficult ones for the Great Britain. But unfortunately, their expectation did not come true. Their anticipation never got materialized. The years after the First World War were very difficult ones for Great Britain. Although Britain had not been invaded or defeated like France and Germany, when we examine the course of the World War First, we can see that Britain had not been invaded or defeated. Like France, one of the Entente, one of the Entente of Britain, and also their enemy Germany. But she was badly shaken up. She was shaken to the very roots. Britain was shaken to the very roots. She was shaken up terribly. Her position on the world's foremost economic superpower was captured by the USA. Till the war, Britain had been the economic superpower in the world. But what happened? The title of having the economic superpower was usurped by the USA. After the First World War, Britain's position in the world as the foremost economic economic superpower was usurped by the USA. British trade and economy were in ruins. British trade and economy suffered very much. After the war, British trade and business were in ruins, and economy naturally became ruins. What happened after the First World War? Britain had heavily ruins. During the war, Britain had heavily borrowed from the USA during the war for herself and for helping her Entente, other countries with Britain like France and Russia. See, Britain heavily borrowed from the USA both for herself and her allies, France, Russia, were known as triple Entente. Triple Entente. France, Russia and Britain were triple Entente. Then there was the enemies known as Triple Alliance. Triple Alliance, the participants of the Triple Alliance were Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy. Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy were the members of the Triple Alliance. So for helping herself as well as the members of the Triple Entente, she borrowed heavily from America. And now, after the war, she had to repay the great national debt she incurred by herself, since the allies were totally crushed economically. The allies were not able to help her. The allies like Russia and France were crushed mercilessly by the Triple Alliance. So, the allies like Russia and France were not able to help Britain at that time. So all the debts had to be paid by the Britain only, British only. Now she had to repay, the Britain had to repay the great national debt all by herself. All by herself, the great debt was paid by all by herself since her allies were totally crushed economically. In 1918, the British Parliament was elected on almost universal suffrage. Universal suffrage means vote by all people, vote by all men. Universal suffrage, universal franchise was exercised during the election in 1918, and in 1918 the parliament was elected on an almost universal suffrage. According to the Representation of the People's Act, which was passed in 1918, all men over 21 and all women over 25 were given the franchise or right to vote. According to the Representation of the People's Act 1918, all men above or over 21 and all women over 25 were given the franchise. Franchise means right to vote. The end of the World War, First World War in 1918, resulted in the demobilization of the army, dismissal of the soldiers in the army. So many soldiers became unwanted after the war. So they lost their jobs. The end of the war resulted in the demobilization of the army. This meant several hundreds of men were now unemployed. As they were dismissed from the army, they became unemployed. Several hundreds of men were now unemployed. The cost of living had shot up. After the World War, there was a great financial crisis. The cost of living shot up. Shot up means rose up, increased. The cost of the living had actually shot up during the war and did not fall back to its original position. This cost of living which rose during the war did not come down. It did not fall down after the war. And the cost of the living which shot up did not fall back to its original levels. Employers wished to reduce wages since the profit margin was very low. The employers wished to reduce the wages given to the laborers because the profit margin was very narrow or very low. Coal mining and railways. Two are connected. Coal mining and railways, the two flourishing industries of Great Britain were badly hit due to the substitution of coal by oil. because of the substitution of coal by oil and the advance of petrol drawn cars, and also this period saw the advancement or the coming or the advent of petrol driven or petrol driven cars. There was discontent and disappointment all around. After the First World War, there was discontent and disappointment all over the country, all over Europe, especially all over Britain. In 1924, the Labour Party was elected, an important milestone in the political history of Britain. In 1924, the Labour Party was elected and formed its first government with Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister. The Prime Ministership went to Ramsay MacDonald. The party, which consisted of socialists and workers group, was looked upon with apprehension initially. People looked up at the efficacy of this political party with doubts at first, with apprehension or doubts or misgivings at first. Anyhow, Labour Party gradually grew stronger, and today, along with the Conservatives, it is one of the chief political parties of England. So it was the development period of Labour Party. Labour Party grew with the years. Labour Party gradually grew, and today, along with the Conservatives or Conservative Party, it has become one of the two chief political parties in England, the Labour Party and Conservative Party. And before the advent of Labour Party, there was Liberal Party in England. There was also Liberal Party. Liberal Party, it has become weaker. The two major political parties, even though there are so many political parties now, about more than 400 political parties exist, the two major political parties in England are the Labour Party and Conservative Party. The Labour Party could not continue its administration for long. Within months it collapsed. After that, the Conservatives took the reins of administration. The time between 1924 and 1929, the time between 1924 and 29, when Conservatives held the reins of administration. The time or the period between 1924 and 29, when the Conservatives held the reins of administration, it was a grim period in England. It was a very bad, sad period in England. Trade had declined drastically. Very rapidly or speedily, trade had declined. Trade, which was one of the backbones of economy, had declined drastically. And the problem of unemployment became more serious. The problem of unemployment became more serious in England. Trade had declined drastically, and the problem of unemployment became more serious. Due to the decline in the demand for coal, because of the substitution with oil, the coal mining declined. Due to the decline in the demand for coal, mine owners and laborers working there, mine owners and the laborers working in mines suffered greatly. They had to suffer greatly. Mine owners decided to lower the wages. What happened? Mine owners decided to lower the wages given to the workers. What is the reason? Since the cost of production had gone up, as the cost of production, cost of mining and the processing had gone up, the mine owners decided to lower the wages given to the workers. This led to miners' strike. This led to a strike by the laborers in the mines. They were soon supported by the miners. The mine workers were soon supported by railwaymen transport workers and engineers. The workers in the mines, or the workers strike, or we can say the miners strike were supported. Miners strike was supported by which all sections? Railwaymen, transport workers and engineers. A general strike of all trade unions. A general strike of all trade unions was declared in 1926, and they decided to have a general strike in 1926. All the trade unions unanimously declared a general strike in 1926. A general strike of all trade unions was declared in 1926. It failed, the general strike in 1926 failed quickly, since the government took up steps to provide transport and food. The government took initiative of providing transport and food in order to defeat the strike. Police and soldiers were called to help the volunteer workers. The volunteer workers of the government were given support by the police and soldiers. The police and soldiers were called to help the volunteer workers. All essential services were in operation, and because of the volunteer workers, police and soldiers, all the essential services, all the essential services, the essential services means the services people greatly demand. All the essential services were in operation, and after a week, the unions were forced to acknowledge defeat. After a week's strike, after anyhow they were going on with the strike, and then the strike came to a stop. And after a week, the unions were forced, they were compelled to acknowledge or approve defeat. Although the general strike was a failure, even though the general strike in 1926 was a failure, the workers used their votes after 3 years. After 3 years means in 1929 general elections. The workers used their votes after the 3 years to defeat the Conservative Party, Conservative government, and to elect the Labour Party once again to power in 1929. So what did the workers do? Even though they were defeated mercilessly, they used their voting power, franchise or suffrage, after 3 years, that is in 1929, to defeat the Conservative government and to elect the Labour Party in 1929. But as far as the Labour Party government was concerned, it was a wrong time. We should say that it was a wrong time for the Labour Party to assume power. Even though they were selected and elected by the people, it was actually a wrong period, a wrong time for the Labour Party to take the reins of power. Why? Because economic condition had not improved. By this time also economic condition was very difficult. There was economic crisis in Britain. Economic condition had not improved, and to make matters worse, to add fuel to the fire, there was a crash in the New York Exchange in 1929, which led to depression all over the world. The crash which happened in the New York Exchange in the year 1929 led to depression, financial crisis, great financial depression, great financial crisis in 1929. That was why it was said that Labour Party took the reins of administration in the wrong time, in the wrong period. They took the reins of administration. Great depression, which was caused by the crash of the New York Exchange, engulfed the whole of Europe. The financial crisis created a panic. This financial depression created a panic among the people. and the Labour government could not deal with the disaster. It was impossible for the Labour government to deal with the disaster, the new disaster they faced. MacDonald called for a national government. MacDonald instituted a national government with all political parties, consisting of conservatives, the liberals, and their Labour Party. Conservatives, and as I told you, there was a party, Liberal Party, and also McDonald's, the Labour Party. Drastic measures were adopted, speedy measures were adopted by the national government to face the crisis. In order to face and overcome the crisis, the national government instituted by MacDonald adopted drastic measures. Drastic steps were taken to face the crisis. Gradually the panic was subsided. Because of the judicious intervention by the government, the panic of economic depression was subsided and the economy began to improve. Between 1933 and 1938, between the period 1933 and 1938, certain new industries began to expand, certain new industries began to surface or expand. Companies involved in all kinds of electrical works, especially the companies involved in all kinds of electrical works began to expand. Electrical works means such as wiring, cable production, and the production of lamps, 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 grew rapidly. In 1936, George V died after reigning over England through a very difficult period, through a period of crisis. In 1933, what happened? In 1933, George V died after reigning over England through a very difficult period. He was succeeded by, after his death, George V was succeeded by his eldest son, Edward VIII, who abdicated after a reign of just 10 months. He abandoned his throne just after 10 months. Edward VIII, who abandoned the throne after a reign administration of just 10 months. His brother, Prince Albert, Edward VIII's brother Prince Albert was crowned King George VI. He was crowned as King George VI. Soon after the World War first ended, the Irish problem became explosive. The Ireland's demand for home rule or independence became highly explosive after the First World War. In 1990, the Irish leaders declared Ireland independence. Bitter fighting followed between Irish rebels and a special British force. This was followed by a bitter fighting between Irish rebels and a special British force. The British police force was nicknamed as the Black and Tans after their khaki uniforms and black helmets. They were wearing khaki uniforms that gave the name tan, and the black helmets gave the name black. Thus they came to be nicknamed as, the British police force was nicknamed as the Black and Tans. The Black and Tans because of their khaki uniform and black helmets. Because of the war between the Irish rebels and the British special force, both the sides committed a lot of atrocities. Both the Irish rebels and the British force did a lot of atrocities that George V pleaded for an end to hostilities. George V pleaded to the Irish rebels to end the hostilities. As a result, a settlement was reached. A settlement between the Britain and Ireland was reached in 1921, in which Southern Ireland agreed to become a British dominion. Southern Ireland wanted to be free, but under a certain control of the British, government. That is why it is said that Southern Ireland agreed to become a British dominion. The new dominion was called Irish Free State. The Southern Ireland became the new dominion of Britain and came to be called Irish Free State. The Southern Ireland came to be called Irish Free State. Northern Ireland continued to remain part of the UK. The Northern Ireland continued to stay as the part of UK, which was renamed. It was also renamed the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Both of them came to be known as, both the Northern Ireland and Britain came to be known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Soon after the war came to an end, soon after the war, which was First World War, soon after the First World War came to an end, there was the immediate post-war mood of frivolity and gay abandon. After the war, people believed that they were in a happy mood, and people began to engage themselves in a mood of frivolity, playfulness, and gay abandon. Gay abandon means happy and carefree life. Gay abandon, happy and carefree life. They began to lead a happy and carefree life. But this was very short-lived. After the First World War, even though people tried to become extremely happy and to lead a merry-go-lucky living, happy-go-lucky living, this was very short-lived. This did not last long. This kind of life did not last long, as it soon gave way to doubt and uncertainty. People's minds became ruled by doubt and uncertainty. People's expectation of peacetime prosperity were people's expectations of peacetime prosperity were dashed as inflation and unemployment continued to rise. As inflation and unemployment continued to rage in England, people's expectations of peacetime prosperity were dashed to the ground. Their expectation of peaceful prosperity was ruined, destroyed. This led them, and this kind of mood led the people into a questioning mood. This gave the people of England a questioning mood, and subjects like ethics related with morality, ethics and religion, subjects like ethics and morality were closely scrutinized. The people began to scrutinize or examine the efficacy of ethics and religion. The people became slowly disillusioned. They were greatly affected psychologically. The people became slowly disillusioned. Disillusioned means disappointed with the ideas of empire and democracy. People became disappointed with the ideas of empire and democracy because these two items did not cater to their needs. They became totally disillusioned and disappointed with the ideas of democracy and the empire system. The experience of the First World War with its large-scale devastation, the experience of the First World War with its large-scale or immense devastation, large-scale destruction, colored. It colored or gave color to the thinking of the people. It added color to the thinking of the people, thinking process of the people. The experience of the First World War with its large-scale devastation colored the thinking of the people. A deep sense of despair and hopelessness. A deep sense of despair. And despair means depression, a disappointment, and hopelessness. Hopelessness cast through a long shadow literature of the age. You know, this kind of disappointment was this kind of disappointment and disillusionment were reflected on literature of the age also. You know, a deep sense of despair and hopelessness cast a long shadow on literature of the age. A mood of pessimism and uncertainty prevailed and was reflected in the literature of the time. There was a mood of pessimism. Pessimism means the habit of looking at the black side of things, or the habit of seeing difficulties in opportunities. The opposite is optimism. Optimism means the habit of the practice of seeing opportunities even in difficulties. A mood of pessimism and uncertainty prevailed, and this reflected in the literature of the time. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, the foundational poem of modernism, T.S. Eliot's Thomas Stearns Eliot's Wasteland. In which year it was published? It was published in 1922. In the same year, the Stream of Consciousness novel by James Joyce, Ulysses, was also got published. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland accurately depicted or captured the post-war mood of the Western world. The post-war mood of the Western world was really accurately depicted or captured in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, having 440 lines with 5 sections. In all areas of art, innovators, those who tried for novelty, in all areas of art, innovators tried to create new forms that would reflect the chaos and frenzy. Frenzy means a kind of madness, frenzy of the times. In all areas of art, innovators tried to create new art forms that would reflect the chaos and frenzy of the times. The 20s saw such experimental works. The 1920s saw such experimental works as James Joyce's Stream of Consciousness novel. Which is it? I have just told you. Ulysses, and the novels of Virginia Woolf. The various innovations of the 20s came to be grouped under the heading. The various innovations and the various tendencies of the 1920s came to be grouped under a single heading of modernism. It came to be under the heading of modernism. The distinguishing feature of modernism was the experimental quality. That is the most distinguishing feature of modernism, the experimental quality. Some of the influences on modernism were imagism and symbolism. Some of the influences on modernism were imagism, the use of images to express ideas and messages. And symbolism means using symbols to express ideas. Imagism introduced by Ezra Pound in the front of T.S. Eliot. Imagism introduced by Ezra Pound used images to communicate a message. These images used the details that could be perceived by the senses. These images used the details that could be perceived by the senses of readers. Symbolism, which was originated in France in the 18th century. Remember, symbolism was first originated in France in the 18th century and made use of imaginative symbols. Symbolism made use of imaginative symbols that could evoke emotions, which could evoke emotions in the readers. Use of images as subtle symbols. The use of so many images as subtle great symbols became a favorite poetic device. The use of subtle symbols became the use of images as subtle symbols became a favorite poetic device of W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot.